Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 6. I hope you have audio and video. If not, please type it into the question box, which I will keep an eye on for a little while. And if there are any questions about last time, now would be a good time to get them out of the way before we start. What you would have to do is raise your hand, and then I can pick you out. If nobody has a question about last time, let's start today with our lecture. We will be talking about the necessity of a ground parallel coffin bone, about hoof function and hoof mechanism. It's a rather short lecture. I hope you have a lot of questions later on. There is a lot of discussion about should the coffin bone be ground parallel, should it not be ground parallel. Brian Hansen is out in Australia to investigate the Brumbies and says their coffin bones aren't ground parallel. A lot of farriers say the same thing. It shouldn't be. Even some barefoot trimmers say, oh, it should be 3 to 5 degrees elevated. Everybody has a little bit of different opinion. I cannot tell you why they say what they are saying, even so I have some suspicions. But I can only tell you that we believe in a ground parallel coffin bone. For us, this is very important, and I will try to explain a little bit to you why. And this will go through the entire course. This will be one of the bases of our teachings, that the coffin bone is ground parallel. As we know, when you set a healthy coffin bone on a flat surface, the distal border of the coffin bone will hug the surface all around, including the palmar processes in the back. As we have seen in the previous picture, these palmar processes pretty much sit flush to the ground as well. This isn't quite the right specimen for this, but it's hard to find good coffin bones. When I look at all the drawings about the skeleton, like this one from the ABC of the horse, an excellent book about musculature and the skeleton of the horse with lots of explanations. All the drawings show ground parallel coffin bones. There's not one where I see a coffin bone that is elevated in the back. And this here is a little animation that kind of shows how the horse moves, and I hope you can see that, and how the horse lands first with the heel and then sets down the entire foot and takes off. We can do this again, and then takes off with over the front of the hoof. One more time, sets it down, and then comes up. And certainly if you think of the horse's hoof as the basis of his skeleton, then it doesn't make good sense to have that basis not flat. However, Bob Cook, from whom this drawing is here, or this markup is, thinks that the farriers actually take their belief system from the solar vault that, as we have seen, is often depicted in a sagittal cut, but doesn't depict the entire coffin bone, whereas we as barefoot trimmers in general take our belief system from the circumference of the coffin bone, and that is what should sit parallel to the ground, not on the ground but parallel to it. And when you look at the coffin bone like this, this just makes good sense. That way everything is fairly solid in the horse's hoof. And we know that when this coffin bone is not ground parallel, which means that it is elevated in the back and would be more like this, that brings the tip down, then we know the horse is in trouble, because if the hoof capsule stays here where it was, then we have rotation in that coffin bone, and this is something we do not want, and this is something that upsets very much the entire function, about which we will talk in a little bit, in the hoof. And we will learn next time how this upsets other things in the hoof as well. So when I look at this picture of a skeleton, of the skeleton of the horse's foreleg, and I don't know why they put this little metal piece in here to elevate the coffin bone in the front. This doesn't make sense either. But you would see how this coffin bone would sit flat and then have the short pastern bone, the long pastern bone, kind of go in a curve up to the cannon bone, and the cannon bone actually should sit upright. This looks as if this has shifted a little bit over time. You remember from when we talked about the blood supply in the hoof, how the circumflex artery at the bottom of the hoof hugs the distal border of the coffin bone. Now, if this coffin bone is not ground parallel, then the circumflex artery will be squished, will be shut off of its function here in the front, because it gets too much pressure here. And if part of this circulation, blood supply in the hoof is not functioning, then that area also will not receive any horn production, because the corium will be compromised in that area as well. So there's another reason why we believe that the coffin bone should be ground parallel, just so that the circumflex artery can function properly. In this picture on the top, you see actually a rotated, slightly rotated coffin bone. You can see this the best by looking at the distance to the hoof wall here, and then how much bigger is the hoof distance to the hoof wall here. But you also can see it kind of by how this swings up, and that is certainly not ground parallel. In this picture it is much more ground parallel. It's much better. This picture is taken a little bit too far from below, so you don't just see the border of the coffin bone that is towards us, but you also see the border of the coffin bone that is on the other side of the hoof. That's because this picture is taken too far from below. When you take radiographs, you have to really make sure that you focus. For example, if you want to make a coffin bone picture, that you focus on the coffin bone middle, somewhere here, and not focus here. Otherwise you get these distortions. You see the distortions here as well. That is the other side of the short pastern bone. This is the other side of the short pastern bone. This is a piece of the navicular bone. We will talk about that again when we talk about radiographs. But for right now, this is a ground parallel coffin bone, and you see also that the alignment here, up here, into the coffin bone is much smoother than it is here. And that is the way it should be. It's not perfect, but this looks much better. Only when the coffin bone sits ground parallel in the hoof capsule will the force of the weight of the horse come correctly onto the hoof capsule. We had talked already about this, how the hoof capsule really hugs all the way around to the coffin bone and mirrors the shape of the coffin bone to a certain extent. So if you look at a hoof caps that looks absolutely perfect, you expect a well-developed coffin bone on the inside. And that altogether makes what we are so much after a sound horse. And we will talk the next time more about how we can determine from the outside, is it ground parallel or not. It's not always easy, it's not always accurate. Most accurate are radiographs, but there are many, many landmarks how we can see if a coffin bone is ground parallel or not. And if somebody says, well, I trim my horses so they have a 3 or 5 degree elevation in the back, so the coffin bone sits at 3 or 5 degrees. My question to this is, and I have not met anybody like this in person, but I hear about this on lists and on calls that I participate in. And I want to know, how do you trim for a certain amount of elevation? May this be 3 degrees, may this be 5 degrees. How are you going to determine how to trim for that? So I'm a fanatic of the ground parallel coffin bone because it makes sense to me. And I'm not alone in this. Let's talk about the functions of the hoof. The most important function of the hoof is for the horse to carry it at high speed, if any possible, over any terrain, with maximum range of motion at any speed for an extended amount of time. And if that happens, then your horse is sound. And in order to stay sound, the horse's hoof capsule and the entire hoof have many functions. So first of all, there is the function of preventing the inside of the hoof from mechanical forces, from banging, bruising, stepping on something. In general, the hoof capsule is very thick and prevents the horse's hoof inside from injuries. Even if you take and drive a nail in the hoof wall, that does not directly injure the hoof. We will talk in the shoeing lecture about what that actually does do, but it does not injure the inside of the hoof. This hoof capsule is reasonably thick, is very resilient, and not only does it prevent the horse from mechanical injury, but it also helps the horse to maintain the correct body temperature, that is 100 degrees, on the inside of the hoof, regardless what the outside temperature may be. These little horses here live somewhere in Siberia and stand most of the time in ice and snow. And they still maintain the correct body temperature to all the inside structures, the circulation functions, the metabolism functions, otherwise they couldn't do their work. On the other hand, we can put a hot shoe on the horse's hoof, and the horn prevents the inside from burning. This is a technique mainly done in Europe, but more and more here as well, that horses are hot shod, that they get the shoe, the farrier heats the shoe and burns it onto the horn, and that way it actually stays a little bit more secure on. You also can just cover a multitude of blunders with that by just burning it on a little bit longer, and that way any trimming mistakes can be burned away. Has all its pros and cons, as long as there can be pros named for shoeing altogether. But in general, the hoof capsule is a fantastic insulator for the inner structures of the hoof. Evenly important is traction. On any terrain, at any time, the horse has to be able to keep contact with the ground, not to slide, not to slip, and to get away quickly. When you think about having a shoe on a horse and then riding over really big rocks, that is a very disconcerting feeling. The horse easily slides with those shoes over a big rock and loses his footing. On ice, you can only imagine how slippery the shoe becomes, and the same is actually true for wet grass that is well groomed. If you ride early in the morning in dew with a short horse and you try to ride a downward transition from the trot to the halt, there's not much happening in terms of halt. The horse will slide a good while before he gets to stand. So all of these things happen with shoes on in terms of providing traction. However, when the horse is barefoot, it has, and is either the hoof is worn correctly or the hoof is trimmed correctly, then you have a suction cup effect on the hoof that allows the horse to negotiate over slippery terrain. Even on ice, the hoof will suck onto the ice, and when the hoof breaks over, the back of the hoof will be lifted. Therefore, the suction at that moment will let go, and the horse can carefully make a step forward without falling down. On rocks, this works in a very similar way. The horse can feel the ground, negotiate his way over this, and does not slide. If you want to provide a little bit more traction on semi-slippery ground like mud or so, you can, and this is this drawing, this square here, you can, in your trim, on a healthy hoof, lower the sole in the bar wall area a little bit more, like a millimeter or so, just in this area, and this gives the horse kind of a grip on the ground, if you feel that this is necessary. On the other hand, when we have soft terrain, when we have horses competing on grass, have them competing on dirt that is slightly soft and slippery, and you have a shoe on that provides too much traction, and the shoe gets kind of stuck in the dirt while the horse is turning. I'm thinking especially about things like barrel racing, big jumping competitions, eventing, all the high speed and fast turn events. Dressage doesn't belong into this, but all the events where the horse has to kind of turn on the spot. And then they have shoes on that dig in, and when the horse is already turning, the shoe is not turning with the horse, and it stays a fraction behind, and that staying a fraction behind torques all the structures above the hoof, and especially the ligaments, and over time those micro tears that happen then in the ligaments provide trouble, and the horse becomes over time lame, and then everybody wonders where this came from. That is from too much traction where it shouldn't be. So this goes both ways. Another function of the whole leg structure and the hoof itself is shock absorption, and the shock absorption is very important. Those of you who have a lot of experience with riding and riding different horses know that a horse that has a long sloped pastern and a little bit of front leg conformation that looks like this, which is very nice, is much softer to ride because of the shock absorption through the alignment of the bones in the distal limb than a horse that has very upright pasterns and that are also very short. Those are usually horses that are a little rougher to ride. Another shock absorber that I would like to mention in this context is that of the thorax. The rib cage in the horse is suspended between the shoulder blades through ligaments, and not like in the humans through a bony connection. We have a collarbone, the horse does not. So these ligaments have a little bit of give in the rib cage, and that is a shock absorber all in itself. But the bone alignment in the horse's hoof is a big shock absorber. And so are the horn tubules in the horse's hoof. These horn tubules are actually formed a little bit like springs. So when they get compressed, they act like shock absorbers. And they have done in Switzerland a study where they put a hoof capsule on a metal crate and photographed it from below how the hoof capsule actually, when weight is put on, how the tubules that don't have the crate, that are not making contact with the crate, do not compress, but the ones that make contact with the crate do compress. But as soon as the weight is taken off, all the horn tubules are the same again. So these horn tubules do indeed absorb shock. And so does the laminar connection between the coffin bone here and the hoof wall. This tissue here, the laminae, gives a little bit when there is weight put onto the horse's hoof and acts as a shock absorber. All of these things are minute, but they all work together. And this is what's really important. When the horse moves, he puts weight first on the back of the hoof and lands first here and then rolls over the front and takes off here. All the while, these bones here move, and so does the lateral cartilage here in the back. And that lateral cartilage, because it is not a bone, it is cartilage, it moves a little bit and stretches and absorbs some of the concussion in the hoof. So the lateral cartilage is a shock absorber as well. Another one that needs to be mentioned as a shock absorber is actually the blood supply in the hoof. We know that the coffin bone is surrounded by corium and that this corium is very vascular, filled with blood, especially on weight bearing. We talk about this in a moment when we talk about hoof mechanism. So as the horse actually weighs the hoof, there is a shock absorber through the blood supply in the hoof, because that blood supply cushions the impact a little bit onto the bone. What is very important for horses, because they are prey animals, is to feel the ground on which they set the hoof or on which they stand. And horses are actually capable of feeling vibrations through the ground. This is one of their survival mechanisms. This is why big cats, tigers, lions, etc., learn to walk really, really careful when they stalk their prey animals, because these prey animals can feel vibrations through the ground. And if the big cat, they are pretty heavy too, just gallops around there, even if they wouldn't see them, they could feel them. And it is very important that the horse can feel the ground. This is why it's an absolute injustice to the horse's flight mechanism and survival mechanism to put a piece of metal between the ground and the hoof, because this takes away the feeling. And it also disconnects the horse from the earth. Not good. So the horse can feel the ground, and with this feeling he is very capable of negotiating over all kind of terrain because he can feel it. This is a picture from Brian Hampson. I just picked it because it has these wonderful rocks, and you can see how hard that ground must be. And this horse is galloping over it without a lot of trouble, it seems. Horses that feel the ground, they don't injure themselves by just stumbling around. They can negotiate this through their proprioceptors in the feet. They know without a shadow of a doubt what they're stepping on. And we often do them injustice, and this is something that we just have to rethink. When horses walk on rocks, they often are very careful. And we have a tendency to interpret this walking careful as my horse isn't totally sound, he is still ouchy on rocks. Well, is he ouchy, or does he say, whoa, I'm not used to this kind of terrain, I better walk a little careful here so I don't injure myself? I'm not saying that there are not horses that are not rehabilitated far enough that they are still ouchy on hard ground, but a sensible horse that lives in a pasture or on soft sand and then all of a sudden gets exposed to hard rocks, to gravel, that has sharp edges, will always walk a little careful on these sharp edges so that he won't injure himself. On the other hand, if you want a horse to be very comfortable on rocks, you have to make him live on rocks, and then he will get used to it in a fairly short amount of time. Now, when horses in the wild move from one terrain to the other, that usually doesn't happen within a few minutes or within a very short amount of time. If a horse would move from my area that is in general very soft to really hard rocky ground, he would have to travel 2, 3, 4 days over various terrain till he gets there. We, however, load a horse in a trailer and take him from the soft, wonderful pasture to some trail ride terrain that kind of looks like this, and then our horses are in trouble because they are not used to this terrain, and what they now feel is by far more than what they can handle. So this is a barefoot horse in the mountains, and obviously these horses are used to it. Actually, I think the one in the back is a mule, and which doesn't change anything. Mules have the same properties in their hoofs as horses. So do donkeys and zebras. All equines are the same. But these horses live on this kind of terrain and do this often, if not all the time, for a living. So they can negotiate this kind of terrain barefoot. And I'm wondering if you would like to ride on this kind of terrain rather barefoot or with a shoe on. If it was me, I would rather go barefoot, and I would do nothing. I would just tell the horse to pick wherever he wants to go, and hopefully he will follow this guy here up front and keep on going. If you also, there are some famous pictures of some horse climbing up the hill at the Tavistock Cup. And there are some horses that negotiate that kind of terrain barefoot. And if they couldn't do this, then they would be long extinct, because the footing where our feral horses live in the western Americas is not quite forgiving either. It looks more like what we see here in the picture. It's desert, and desert is not sand, it's rocks. It's very hard footing. So feeling is very important. That is was one of the hoof functions. Now we talk for a little bit about this very important hoof mechanism, hoof deformation or hoof flexion, whatever you want to name it. It's known under all of these, and it comes with a lot of controversy. Again, we have to, everyone has at any time to subscribe to a certain paradigm of thinking, and what I want to share is our paradigm and how we got to this, and why we're not exactly in sync with some other paradigms. Hoof mechanism is the ability of the hoof capsule to flex upon weight bearing and to be restored to its original form upon the horse taking the weight off of the hoof capsule, which it does many, many times every day while it is moving around from a piece of grass to a piece of grass, little by little, going on and on and on. This deformation of the hoof capsule, this flexion, is shown in green here. The bars, because they are continuation of the hoof wall, flex as well. The hoof capsule does not flex at its 0 point. It only flexes further back. How far back depends a little bit how the whole hoof capsule is built. Now, the farrier trade claims that if you put only nails into the hoof to fasten the shoe in front of the widest point of the hoof, then the hoof still will have hoof mechanism and still will flex. These are 8 nails. Some farriers trim shoe with only 7 nails. They leave on the inside 1 away. Doesn't matter. If you now have this whole area here fastened, and it can absolutely not move. Nobody says it can. And you have the whole back moving, you would have to have somewhere, here, a hinge, so that this area actually could move out and flex while this all stays put. And maybe there is a reason why some horses, when certain forces on the hoof come together in connection with hoof mechanism in the back of the hoof and a stabilized front, have quarter cracks. Because if this moves and this doesn't, and there is no hinge in the hoof, then eventually this material here will weaken and will start to crack. So that is why we do not believe that this is correct, that the hoof can move in the back but doesn't need to move in the front. It needs to have the ability to flex all around. And this flexion is not that you can see it with the naked eye. You have to really look close and This here, even so I drew this fairly as close as I can think, it is not as much as it is here in the drawing. It is less. Nevertheless, it has a huge impact on what happens on the inside of the hoof. At the 0 point, at the very front of the hoof capsule, we said that the hoof capsule does not move, but it sinks in here on the top of the coronet band a little bit. This is part of the hoof mechanism. As the coffin bone descends, remember I said it has a little give in the laminar connection. As it descends that little bit, it also caves in here where the red arrow is a little bit. And in this schematic, it so kind of shows what is happening. In a non-weight-bearing hoof, the walls are comparatively upright and the sole is very vaulted. Now this is only a schematic, and don't take this that there's a lot happening. But to show this, when the horse becomes weight-bearing, the bottom of the hoof capsule moves further out, while the top of the hoof capsule moves further in. And the sole becomes flatter, not flat, flatter. A little bit flatter, a hair flatter. Because if it would become all the way flat, it would tear on the sole corium, because the coffin bone's not following that much. You know, the coffin bone moves down maybe 1 millimeter, so the sole gets flatter by 1 millimeter, but not by, oh, all of a sudden it's totally flat. So let's look at this with a little bit better. I think these drawings are better. When the horse is weight-bearing, the blood supply, the arterial blood supply, comes into the hoof because the walls move a little bit more out in this direction on the bottom, and there is a little more room because the walls actually pull the sole a little flatter because it's connected here. And there is a little bit more room in the laminar corium as well as in the sole corium. With this little bit more room, more blood can come into the hoof upon weight bearing. And I have tried to show this here a little bit at a slice of a hoof by pulling that apart, which is actually very hard to do. Just to, even so you see how thin a slice this is, but try to pull this apart. It doesn't give a whole lot. So in the next phase, the horse is now non-weight bearing, and you see how these walls are comparatively more upright. The sole is more vaulted again. The corium is thinner because now the blood is expressed and delivered to the venous plexus on top of the coronary band. And here I try to resemble this by pushing this more together. The sole is now more vaulted, the walls are more upright. The pushing it together was much easier than the pulling it apart. So this is step 2. The horse is non-weight bearing. The next step, the horse becomes weight bearing again. Just like in step 1, the walls move out here, and the top of the walls, where they are slightly curved around the coronary bulge, are moving actually in. And with this moving in, They push the blood, the venous blood, out of the coronary bulge, out of the venous plexus. At the same time, arterial blood comes into the space that is created by weight bearing around the coffin bone at the solar corium and the lamellar corium. I hope that this makes sense. We'll see. This is what happens when the horse becomes weight-bearing on an unshod hoof. You see how the bulbs, this is a view from behind, how the bulbs move apart and how the bottom of the hoof moves apart. I hope you can see this. This morning it didn't work at all. So we're one step closer. Now when you have a shoe on, this is what happens. The shoe fixes the wall on the bottom, and it only can come out on the top at the coronary band. Doesn't mean it doesn't move, but it doesn't move correctly. And this here is the two previous animations were from our colleague Peter Speckmeier in Germany. He has made all these animations, and I think they have gone around the world a few times. I think they're very good. So here we have, excuse me, here we have hoof mechanism as it happens when the horse is on soft ground. The hoof sinks in, it still expands, but you see how the bottom of the terrain fills out the entire sole. Let this run a few times so you have a chance to look at all the different structures. You can see actually how here when it's weight bearing the corium expands. This here would be the navicular bone. This here would be the deep digital flexor tendon, the palmar processes, and the lateral cartilages. So let's do this again. And when you have this non-weight bearing, then the corium areas are much less full with blood. Here you have the same hoof mechanism, but now it's on hard ground, on ground that doesn't give, and it looks a little different. You see that the ground does not fill out the bottom of the sole of the hoof, does not make contact with the sole, but still the corium expands and allows the blood to come into the hoof. Okay, so this was everything I can think of about hoof mechanism, and it is very important, and we will talk about this during trimming, that you know about hoof mechanism in many ways, because it can be an excellent thing to facilitate healing. It can also be a detriment to the soundness of the horse, and that will become clearer as we go through this course, I promise you. Now I would like to open this. I know this was today a little bit shorter, other lectures are a little bit longer,